Okay, cool. Hi. Welcome to our tech forecast. Unfortunately, there's 5 names up there, but Scott is a ghost. He had to fly back to Berlin. I'm sorry about that. Wished you would have been here, but we've got a great panel today. I'm Daniel. I'm going to be emceeing. I started my career in the volunteer sector, and today I'm thankfully still working on a project some of you might know as Tauri. It's a thing to make stuff for people, usually apps. And today I've got, directly on my right, I've got Dahl. Ryan, do you want to just tell us where you started your career and where you're at today?
Hello. Yeah, I started in math. I wanted to be a math professor, but then I dropped out and got into programming, and I'm best known for creating Node. And now I have been working on Dino the past couple of years.
We'll dig in later. Isaac, you want to introduce yourself and where you're from, where you're at?
Sure. I got started in PHP and making websites. I'm got into server-side JS, and I'm most well known for making NPM. The last 6-7 months, I've been creatively filling my time and not getting paid by anybody. And I'm about to do another startup in the package management space called Volt.
Nice. Rachel, same question to you.
I got into tech by making webcomics for teenage girls back in the day. And that turned into building websites and working on the web animations API with the W3C. Worked at a couple of browsers, probably remember me from React.dev. That was my most recent project. But yeah, generally just here to help build the web forward.
Cool. So we want to get one thing out of the way. AI. Isaac. Are we still going to have jobs in the future?
Yes, unfortunately.
Can you explain what you mean?
Well, unfortunately, just because this is like a function of living under capitalism, we all have to give away all of our free time in our life in order to be allowed to live. But I think that the, as far as like replacing programmer jobs, I feel like nobody who actually works with computers in a deep way ever really says that, because if you look at any of the cases where people are actually doing interesting and innovative things with AI and look at what goes into what it is that they're doing, it's a lot of computer stuff. It's a lot of like, software development. We have, we have with AI some really interesting tools for doing very, very elaborate and like sophisticated like data mining and data analysis, which is fascinating, interesting stuff, but ultimately it's just another tool. You still need people to use it.
Is anybody going to lose their job?
Well, somebody's always losing their job. Like, it's like saying like, oh, well, now that we have word processors, are we going to have like, does anybody need to even know how to type? It's like, well, yeah, just in a computer instead of a typewriter. I don't see this as really much different.
But when you were a kid, Rachel, if you were to transplant yourself from back then to today, doing webcomics, would you have used like generative AI to make backgrounds and images?
A lot of the hardest things to do in comics were colors, inking, and background generation. You can already see people doing this in the comics industry. If you've ever read cheaply translated comics from Korea on Webtoon, most of those backgrounds are from stock footage, and like they've been generated with 3D programs, and they're just barely outlined. So people have already been finding these shortcuts. They've just found another shortcut. Maybe a better one that will create richer, more aligned with the artist's work backgrounds, for instance.
Like, I studied art history, right? And
yeah.
I know there was a point in time where the photographers were like, you don't need to paint anymore, right? But if you look back at the history of painting, painters have always been using the most advanced optical tools available to them to make better paintings.
But portraiture is no longer a job.
Yeah, painting is actually really interesting, because if you look at what happened when photography kind of became a thing, around the same time, like Impressionism and other sort of forms of like more abstract art rise in popularity, because now it's like, oh, well, this is something that just the machine can't do, right? The magic trick of like painting a thing that looks like real life is no longer all that impressive, just like the magic trick of being able to like construct a grammatical sentence is no longer all that impressive. I think in the world of like both art as well as visual art as well as just prose and writing and poetry, like we might see a resurgence of things that are dramatic departures, right? Like writing something that's actually rude might be more kind of compelling or interesting as your marketing copy because you can't easily get an AI to like act in that way.
AI can't write Saturday Night Live skits. With ones that aren't awkward cringe humor, at least. Okay,
I don't
some
know if
people
it's Saturday
watch
Night Live.
Okay, I'm
can
glad.
always-
Thank you. But no, to get back to the cartoonist thing, one of the things I wanted the most when I was youngster was to see my comics come to life as a cartoon. But to do that, my comics would have to get popular enough to attract the eye of a media executive mogul. But now we're at a place where probably within this generation's lifetime, somebody can have a great idea for an original concept and get it most of the way animated on their own or with the help of their friends. You can already see this in the work of like Kane Pixels on YouTube. It's not AI generated, but this is a kid, 17, with a couple of friends who's created an entire oeuvre of work that's very advanced just using software available today.
Well, I'm going to dig in right there. You know, I remember in the 80s using actually blocking the landline for my 2400 baud modem. And then in the 90s, I got this AOL demo CD. And like, it's clear that the way that we interact with the internet is changing, has been changing. So what internet will today's children grow up into?
Wow, I have some opinions on that one. The internet has always existed as our way to access the sum of human knowledge that's been put out there. And it's used a document model for a long time. And one of the reasons I've always loved like web animations and using the web to be more than just a glorified PDF is because the internet can be so much more, right? It can be games, it can be animations, it can be, videos and streaming, and there's so many ways to interact with that information. But the web as a model, there's a browser and the interaction model is forms. Let's be honest, it's forms. But now, we're experiencing a plethora of new tools. We've only just seen them, like recently, seen the tip of what they can do, and they're very infant forms. And they can be very handy for helping us navigate what is more content than we will ever be able to read in one lifetime. Do you really think that in 20 years, people are still going to be sitting down and reading through a Wikipedia article on a gigantic LCD that keeps them up late at night? For me, I often just interact with my smart speakers and ask them questions, and they just sum up information and give it back to me. I think the tools we have now, browsing the internet might not be like reading a PDF. It might become a much more personal experience that doesn't involve, reams of ads. The browsers that we have today, I feel they have had many opportunities to innovate on the experience of browsing, and up until Arc, as of recently, we haven't had anything much better than the tabs across the top of the screen that Google's Chrome launched with. It's like, come on, Microsoft, come on, Firefox, you had your chance. You had your chance to make this a better experience and change it. And we stalled. I feel like we've stalled. That interaction has stalled, and it's ripe for a change up. So I'm hoping that in 20 years, people don't have to stare at an LCD to get what they're looking for from the sum total of human knowledge. It's especially not one with 100 open tabs.
Have either of you tried using Apple Vision for coding yet?
No.
Do you think that'll become a thing?
Maybe.
Yes.
if it works well enough, if it's light enough, why not?
I still haven't made the jump from Vim to VS Code. I'm the wrong guy to ask on that.
Can't get out of it, yeah.
No, I'm stuck. Can't figure out how to close it. It's impossible.
Why would we even need an editor?
Yeah.
In 20 years, people might be doing coding by conversation. I say this because I was just hanging out with a dude who built a verbal language for editing code. And it's so cool because you can navigate your code editor with your voice. And I was like, oh my God, this is really cool. It's not at the point that unsighted people could use it. It's more of to verbalize how you, it's called cursorless. It's an open source project. It's kind of cool if you want to use your voice to use your editor versus, clicking around. I don't know, there's a lot of room to, maybe we won't even use a
I don't even like
display.
voice communication with other human beings, to be honest.
That's fair.
I don't see, and I've been in enough situations of trying to talk about code where we just give up and go to an editor. Like, I feel like we have a really good several really good sophisticated dialects and sort of prompt vocabularies for telling a computer very precisely what to do, and their programming languages. Like, they're so good at it. They're so good at it.
Are they though? I mean, like what was it? The White House Office of the National Cyber Director just declared that we should make software more memory safe, right? Like 70% of all of Microsoft's vulnerabilities have come from things like use after free. So maybe, but we have.
But I don't think. But
enough.
a better. I mean, expressing your program in prose, in English prose, rather than in a programming language doesn't solve that problem. That problem is solved by having computer paradigms that don't allow for unsafe memory usage. And those things come with trade-offs, like everything else. So, how do you still need people who have some concept of what it is that they're trying to make that can express it in a precise way. And I think that there's definitely room for if you look at kind of the progression from machine code to low-level programming languages to higher-level scripting languages, it can be really nice to sort of have a framework and a base layer and then be like, okay, this gives you a lot of functionality and you can sort of pilot this around at this layer. And there may be room for another layer on top of that, but there's still people writing C. There always will be.
Ryan, do you still write C?
Not that much anymore. It's probably been 2 years since I wrote C.
You write Rust sometimes, though.
I write Rust every day. I have no idea what will happen, of course, but I can imagine that there are fewer developers in the future programming kind of hands-on keyboard sort of thing. But like anything, that doesn't mean that there's not going to be a time when one needs to open the hood of the car and go in with a wrench and do all of the, I don't know how a Toyota works, but somebody in the world does, right? Maybe we don't need to have 1 out of 10 people being a car mechanic like we did in the past. There's specialists for this sort of thing, but certainly somebody knows how a Toyota works, right? It's not going to be completely abstracted away. So I guess I disagree a little bit with Isaac that, the kind of developer situation of everybody kind of programming is necessarily going to be the same in the future. It's very possible that we might just talk to computers for most things. Make me a form to submit to the bank, whatever. But there will always be people who dive in. There's always C programmers, and there's always assembly programmers, and there's always people who know how to build semiconductors.
Oh yeah, I think also part of it is there's actually new opportunities for places to dive in. I don't know if he's here in the crowd, but I was really fascinating talk from Mikhail Lysenko the other day about basically the way that they're using at Socket, they're using LLMs to detect malware, and they're not writing the code that has the heuristics that find the malware in the software that they're detecting, but they do a lot of pipeline management, and it's much more of a high level money in and then setting up the pipeline so that some result will come out, and it's still engineering. It's a different kind of engineering. It's not scripting what a particular processor does, but it's a very similar kind of software development.
Yeah.
But they also absolutely keep people in the loop, don't they? If a prompt detects that there's some potential malware, once you have a certain degree of uncertainty, a human operator comes in
looks at it
and says, no.
Well, that's just because the LLMs are still bad. They're not they're very fast, and they're not great. So like you need a human to,
Well, back to the
make that final test.
To the mechanic metaphor, increasingly to streamline maintenance of ever more complex cars, they're testing harnesses that cars can be hooked up to. They still need a mechanic to assess the results of those tests, and they do look like a command line when you get them back. These poor guys, they got no UX at all put into these things. But point is, they specialize in reading the test results and investigating where the tests lead them, rather than understanding each individual component of hundreds of different cars. If anything, programming is showing up in more places. It just has different guises, and comes down to the human making the call. The human doing the last mile, going out, investigating, and making sure that the thing is actually the thing, rather than just looking at the dashboard. There's so many stories of there's this one story about the plane that crashes because people only checked the dashboard, but they didn't actually do the physical check to look out on the wings. You can't just trust the interface. You have to. It's a smell, but it's not a tell.
Cars are designed today with the implication that there's people inside, right? And this has always been the case, right? Like, you still have a wheel, right, Waymo? But the notion that we needed seatbelts in cars didn't arrive when cars arrived, right? And I think that as we develop, as the situation around what we're doing develops, changes our needs, then we adapt to them, right? Like now you can literally go to San Francisco and get driven entirely to a place with your voice command and your credit card and your app, right? And like that kind of change, maybe it's been possible with better software or more people working on it, but I think there's also a societal aspect to that as well. Like we are now comfortable in trusting ourselves to autonomous vehicles. And I guess, as entrepreneurs on the stage as well, we have seen companies start open source and then rug pull the license and make things complicated for people who didn't have to pay in the past. And I see that this landscape is shifting over the past 20 years as well, where in the beginning open source was great for companies, and now because they were able to profit off of it, and now companies are building with open source but realizing, shoot, it's hard to monetize this stuff. And then now we have the next generation of commercial open source software, and we have open core licensing, and I'd love to hear your perspectives on where this is going. Is there an end game, or are we just continuously reacting to suddenly being in driverless cars?
I mean, I think in the dev tools space, you are building infrastructure, and there's quite a lot of people who feel uncomfortable relying on infrastructure that is going to have some price tag attached to it because they might get exploited. I think it's a pretty much unsolved problem, like how open source and business interact. I think it's relatively clear that open source projects add a lot of value to society, and it's pretty clear that they are expensive to develop. I think it's also pretty clear that open core as a model, that is like adding on proprietary features to existing software, is not ideal because it kind of
creates perverse incentives.
Yeah, it kind of sets you up to not do what's in the best interest of the users. I think there are kind of models where you can provide orthogonal services to the open source project, and you don't have those kind of difficult incentive problems. Although I don't know, it's still difficult.
I honestly think this is a great example of I feel like a lot easier to make a prediction about 50 years in the future than it is to make a prediction about 5 years in the future. I think that it is kind of unsustainable and ultimately in nobody's best interest for-profit companies to reap the benefits of open source software development that is born almost entirely by unpaid volunteer labor. As long as as long as companies are getting the benefit of that value and not putting their money where their mouth is, so to speak, it's a fundamentally brittle situation. It's a very fragile situation, and it ultimately puts those companies on a kind of shaky ground. They can't really trust the open source that they're using because they don't have a relationship with the developer. There's no reason for that developer not to just put a bunch of malware in their systems, which they will be able to do very easily. It's happened a bunch of times. And also, from the point of view of the developer building the thing, like, what's the incentive to, frankly, to give a shit about these like billion-dollar corporations that are using my code and giving me nothing? And at the same time, though, I think that there's something to be said for the intrinsic motivation of like, I created a thing, I created it for my own reasons, or I just thought it'd be a cool thing to create, and I want it out there being used in the world. What I don't want is all of the work and obligation and BS that comes along with that, because once Microsoft starts using my code, now they start sending me updates that they want me to change my license because I put the wrong copyright date, all that BS, like, I have no incentive to care about that. And I think that a lot of open source developers, especially when they're newer, they kind of like do a lot of this extra free labor because they feel like they should, or like it's the right thing to do, or like they have to in order to get their name out there and get that visibility.
Get those green squares.
Yep, and then after a certain point in your career, you realize that it's kind of dumb and stop caring.
Special kind of frequent flyer miles program. Except you never get your free trip to Maui. And unless you're invited to speak at a conference, because you're...
This is my free trip to Maui, right here.
Exactly, it's rainy Netherlands. Good deal. You only had to like give up most of your youth for it. I actually, one of the things I've noticed, like I've seen how it really works well. I think React Native is a great example of corporate open source. There's a good, strong community partner in Expo. And then you have Microsoft working with Meta to maintain and expand React Native, make it better for both parties. These two engineering teams would not work together if it weren't for open source. Microsoft would be building one thing, Meta would be building another thing, and it would be a complete, from a human species perspective, a complete duplication of effort. And the library itself would not be as advanced as it has. I see open source as like the way that companies can kind of like call a truce and then pool their efforts across two different knowledge bases to create something that's useful across many. And I love seeing that. But I've also seen something that kind of doesn't feel like it's in the spirit of open source, and I'm wondering if you might have thoughts on this. Open source, it's open, you can read the source code, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the company that developed it and launched it as open source is going to share its roadmap, especially if it's a key cornerstone of their, for instance, what makes them money. I've seen a lot of open source projects over the years that sort of start as a free taste, if you will. Yes, it's open source, it's good, it has that blessing of this is from the community and for the community, but it actually is just an entree point to a consolidated stack or a pricing model.
Open washing.
Is that the future of open source? Is that how you get people paid for their work, or?
I don't think so. I think most open source communities have a very low tolerance for that kind of like open washing.
Ooh, open washing. That's a good word.
Yeah, like in the same as like greenwashing, right? Like, oh, we planted a bunch of trees, and so it's fine that we're harvesting oil. I think what is, kind of the flip side of that is what we've seen in a lot of cases now, where like a company builds something, or they build a company around an open source product, and they are fine with you taking that open source product and using it, and then at a certain point they realize that they're being, like when they're going in to try and secure these enterprise deals and make money to keep the lights on, their potential customers are going with a competitor who is selling exactly the same thing at a lower price point because they don't have to develop it. So HashiCorp recently came out with, they had adopted the business source license. That's kind of where it first crossed my radar. They think an earlier company had developed it, I forget which. There's also something that Sentry has developed. NDN.io has also kind of gotten on board with this, something called the functional source license. And essentially what these licenses are, like from a very strict OSI point of view, they're not technically open source because the uses to which you can put the thing are limited. So with HashiCorp's license, it's basically like essentially the same as the MIT license unless you compete with HashiCorp, in which case you're not allowed to do that with this code.
Well, you got to sign a non-compete to use our code.
Well, that's where it gets very fuzzy, because you don't have to sign a non-compete to use their code. It's just if you compete with them, your license to the code is revoked. And it's not exactly clear what compete means, or which things you need to be competing with, or in what specific ways. That's kind of like HashiCorp's, it's up to HashiCorp to decide. The functional source license is a little bit more clear-cut. What I would like to see that I think is still doesn't really exist in the ecosystem is you can only use this for non-commercial purposes. You can use it for any non-commercial purpose you want, and if you want to use it for commercial purposes, you have to pay us, and it's a flat rate, like non-discriminatory, fair and non-discriminatory license fee. That would also not be technically open source because use would be limited, but I think the kind of open source versus free software dichotomy that we've been living in is both of those, like that being the choice really works in favor of the giant corporations that kind of drive our tech ecosystem.
That's how the term open source was created in the first place, right? Like back in the 90s.
The source is open.
The source
you
is
can
open.
use it.
Please, big corporations, don't be afraid to use this, to share. Sharing is good, and that was the first wave of layoffs that we saw because you didn't need 50 people to reinvent HTTP, right? You just take it because it's there, like that, it kind of raises the question though. You're maybe to blame for the ISC license being the default license in projects where you run npm init.
Uh-huh.
Why did you choose that? Would you choose differently today?
Well, I've recently started using Blue Oak, the Blue Oak model license. I like it better. I'm probably like the what's the word, like the persistent nail that got Blue Oak to be approved by the OSI, because a bunch of people complained to me that like, hey Isaac, you're using this license that's not OSI approved, can you change your license? And I was like, fuck you, pay me. And then they were like, okay, well we can't do that, so I guess we can't use Glob or Minimatch or any of these other things that you have used this license on. And I was like, cool, yeah, sounds great, totally understand. And then they came back a few months later, like, actually, it turns out we can't avoid using your code, it's everywhere. So some folks from the the OpenJS Foundation pushed Blue Oak through, and now it's OSI approved. And I never had to lift a finger to change anything, which is exactly what I wanted.
Firm and
yeah.
No, this is my standpoint.
But as far as what's the difference between Blue Oak?
It's written in plain English, which I like. It has some patent, some like mutually assured destruction protections for patent and copyright, my
ISC is
my friend Kyle wrote it. I don't know. I liked it.
If you don't know Kyle Mitchell.
Kyle Mitchell, yes, he's an awesome guy.
Look him up. He does a lot of work with Heather Meeker, I think, and Blue Oak is great. I think the other one, Polyform, is pretty interesting, but it's definitely not OSI compliant.
Yeah, exactly. So the reason for ISC, I originally was all about the MIT license because I grew up in New England, and that felt patriotic. And then I moved to the East Bay in San Francisco Bay Area, and I lived in Oakland, which is near Berkeley, so I switched everything to use BSD because, East Bay, pride. And then the thing I liked about the ISC license is it's simpler language, and there's a bunch of stuff that was cut out of it that doesn't need to be there anymore as of the mid-90s or whenever the Bern convention was. And also, if you kind of squint your eyes, it almost looks like my first name. So I chose that as the default that NPM would use.
Now we know.
But they're all the same, right? They're all functionally equivalent. Like MIT, BSD, and IC, there is no legal difference between them. When you get into like Apache 2 and Blue Oak, you have some other like patent stuff, so that gets a little bit more sophisticated.
What do you think of the term GPL poisoning? You've heard that, right? You know what that is?
No.
Basically, when you're in a repository and you're pulling in, third-party resources and you're doing your license check because legal asks you to do it, and suddenly there's a GPL3 license that pops up, it basically theoretically forces you to publish all of your changes to that library or things that are included in your release. So it's a terrible term, but it kind of gets the point across from a legal perspective. Imagine like being a lawyer at the company and going through a stack of documents this big because you asked the devs to print out every single license, and then they're like, GPL3, no, you have to reverse engineer the whole library.
Here's the thing, I don't think that you should base any business decisions on your source code being private, first of all. And second of all, I think it's perfectly fine to assume that every actor who matters is going to follow the rules of your license. So if you have something like the functional source license or the business source license, I mean, these things work because companies like Microsoft and Google play by the rules for the most part. They make the rules to be in their favor, but when it comes to the sanctity of IP law, none of them are going to go against that. None of them are going to do anything that's going to jeopardize that. That's why Oracle v. Google was such a big deal. Not because of the specific amounts of, the amounts of money involved were meaningless to both companies. What actually mattered was how does IP work? Because this is sort of the blood that runs through the veins of these giant fearsome creatures. And so yeah, you can pretty much just release everything as at least exposed source, even if it's not open developed, community-led open source, we're all friends here kind of open source, with a license that says, you're not allowed to use this. Here's the code, you can't use it. Somebody's gonna, but they don't matter, and you can't sue them for anything anyway, and they were never gonna be your customer. The companies that are gonna follow the rules, because they actually have something to lose.
But at companies, you need people to tell developers what to do, right? We were talking earlier about this, right? It was you mentioned that developer advocacy is changing into influencership, right? And what's next for these business entities? How are they going to talk about code if it's private or if it's now public? And what's your take on that? Where's this going?
Oh man, that's a segue. I'm not sure if I can tie that back to open source. But one thing, in the beginning, I don't know, when I say in the beginning, I mean my beginning. Obviously this industry has a much longer history than my existence. My mom was a systems engineer, so there you go. She worked in COBOL on mainframes. She never wanted me to get into tech because she was like, oh, you make one mistake and it's all over. You're going to hate it. You'll be too impatient for it. And I was like, well, we got linters. So anyways, suck on that, Mom. Back when I first got into tech,
are there even jobs for programmers now that we have linters?
No, you just need Copilot and a good linter and just put them alone in a room together for a while, come back, and they've built you Microsoft.
Yeah.
You don't need humans. What could humans possibly contribute to this process that's of any worth?
Just bugs.
Just arguing.
Yeah.
By the way, when is that awesome pay for usage? What are you going to launch that? Think of a really catchy name because it's obviously not open source. You got to give it a snappy name, the friendly, good for developers, pay me, fuck you, pay me license. Something like that.
Yeah, something like that. I feel like fuck you, pay me is a little too hostile. It's just hostile enough for developers, but it's a little too hostile.
Love you, pay me.
Love you when you pay me.
Yeah, love you, pay me. Okay, back to influencership. I had to know. Think on it. I think you've got something there. You just
I'm terrible at naming things.
You can spin this. I know. You got to do it. You got to change the next 20 years. Save open source.
I think it's called SaaS. Right? It's just proprietary software at that point.
It's not proprietary because it's got community at the heart of it.
Well, and there's a difference, right? If I write something that's free for non-commercial use, or you can use it if you pay us for it, you can take it and build something else with it as long as you're not using it in a commercial way. You can use it for free.
Kind of defeats the purpose, though, because everything's commercial.
This is why you have humans.
Ultimate. Not everything,
Computers
but
can't do this.
99% of what we're doing is commercial efforts.
And yet, people writing open source get paid zero.
That's
what I'm saying.
It's not a perfect system, but I don't know. I mean, we're doing fine. Like, we wrote a lot of software. Like, I don't know. It's not like
you should be a lot
developers are
richer
doing
at this point.
terrible.
What I'm saying is that Ryan should not have to work for a living anymore because he made Node. Like in a perfect world, you'd be done.
That would be great. Yeah.
Speaking of people who get paid to make cool stuff for a living, I remember I wanted to grow up to be a developer advocate. I did, because I saw developer advocates of my generation. They made cool demos, and they came to conferences, gave talks about the cool demos, and people would be like, we love you. And I also liked travel. Now, developer advocates typically kind of like own a territory, and they're not going to ship you to a new territory if they've got an advocate already there. It's so commoditized. But back when I first started, we didn't have advocates. We had something called, does anyone remember evangelists, developer evangelists? Yeah, I see some heads nodding. And they typically were owned, pat, by a big corp like Adobe or Microsoft. And they would never leave these companies. They just lived there. Like, we see you, Scott Hanselman. We know you've been there since you were out of college. We get it. You're Microsoft's boy. And damn, he does a great job on stage.
Here to tell you the good news about .NET.
Oh my God. But yeah, so, big companies had these swarms of evangelists who'd go out and they'd be live coding and impressing the engineers with their top elite skills. But then, this era came along, JavaScript Nation became a thing, and the W3C was engaging with the communities to build standards, and we got the developer advocate, which was more of a representing the developer to the companies that they worked for, or the organizations. They go out, they run some workshops, come back and be like, hey, people are struggling with this or that. And they would bring the company's ideas and percolate them through the community. And that happened. But ever since the pandemic, I've noticed a huge shift. Advocacy teams are, I don't know if you've seen the layoffs news, but even people I look up to, sometimes they don't have a job from one week to another. And more of the advocacy teams are being roped into marketing teams and rolling up to marketing KPIs, key performance indicators. And we're seeing a rise in developer influencers. Sort of like you have influencers in fashion and, I don't know, weightlifting? I don't know. Gaming, there we go. We have other industries have influencers, and they do sponsorships, and there's this authenticity versus making money dichotomy. And you're starting to see this show up, like you're watching YouTube videos of your favorite engineers, and they have hundreds of thousands of followers, which developer advocates often don't have. I mean, if they had them, they'd be making YouTube videos like Theo and making money that way, having sponsorships. But I think we're at a point where we're going to be more and more influenced by individuals in the community versus individuals who are whose salary is paid for by a company. But we might not always see how individuals and what they're sharing is perhaps still being paid for by companies. This is something that influencer models struggle with in other industries as well. The FCC tries to control this and set rules, but much like with crypto, where there is no regulation, profiteering will always find a way. What do you think? How might this impact the open source community if we're seeing sort of the democratization, but also the obfuscation of leadership and sponsorship?
I mean, I feel like it's a net improvement, actually. A lot of the biases that any given influencer or, like, it's all the same thing, whether it's like what's the difference between evangelism and influencing? Like, they're both just like saying things to get you to feel a certain way about something. Usually positive about something. I feel like there's a lot more criticism now and a lot more of a gotcha culture around uncovering that people are in fact biased because they've been bought out by Adobe or whatever.
You know who Scott works for.
Right. But also I don't feel like that's ever really a mystery. You know that what's his name? The bald English guy with the awesome voice, Matt Pocock.
Yes, Matt Pocock.
Matt Pocock on
TypeScript.
the TypeScript dude. I love that guy. But like, I know that he's biased in favor of TypeScript, obviously. Like, so am I, and that's why I like his stuff. I mean, I don't know. I kind of feel like there is this like, you see this as like the drama on like, you know, YouTube influencer circles all the time. Like discovering that somebody's actually been sponsored by someone and they didn't like disclose that or whatever. But like, they still get tons and tons of views, and some people are good and some people are less good.
I've got some thoughts. Did you want to add anything there? You look like you're holding back.
No, I guess I don't have much to add, but I mean, it seems to me like DevRel is a marketing role in the same way that a sales engineer is a sales role. I mean, it's kind of, you know, an engineering role targeting a certain goal. Developer, whatever you want to call it, DevRel, developer advocacy, is you know, trying to get the word out about software. And yeah, as far as I am concerned, like absolutely should be like trying to solve company KPIs in that direction.
I can hear the hissing from some old school dev advocates out there who are like, but we manage communities and we educate us.
It's always been about like, if it's not the marketing ROI for your company who's paying you, then the other motivator is your personal brand and your own fame and ego. And like, both of those are perfectly fine as long as they're like honest and you kind of take that into consideration when you're consuming the content. I don't know, I don't feel like there's anything particularly like, you know, unsavory about either of those.
I think when you look at other industries that have influencers already, like fashion, et cetera, we're actually at the very beginning of the adoption curve. They've gone all the way over here into left field where sponsorship is expected. If you see somebody you respect using a product, you expect that it was given to them. And the people who are influencers are also very careful about who they work with and what they say, because like you don't want to be caught promoting something that's not very good, because it burns trust with your audience. And your audience and the trust you have with them is the actual product that people are trying to give you money for access to. So you find influencers are very good at curating who they partner with. We're not quite there yet in tech from what I've seen, but I think disclosing, for instance, this is a sponsored video. These are best practices that other industries are using. We're getting better at using them. And I don't think it's going to be the taboo. Like, people are going to get used to it. Like, yeah, this was a sponsored video. That's how my guy makes money to keep making the content that I love. I'll give it a whirl. And it just hasn't had the long-term burn in other industries that I think we're afraid it might have in this one.
But I mean, I just think back to the recent fiascos that Theo has been engaged in, right? Like, here, this is GitHub, do stuff. And repos are getting swarmed and people are up in arms, and I think that
what's the recent fiasco that Theo's been in on?
Yeah, well, that's just one of the recent ones, right? Where he was explaining to people,
because that seems like his shtick, and I don't mean that in a disparaging way at all. Like, I love his content. I follow him on Twitter. But like, there's always some drama.
Yeah.
Like,
the internet is like a very large high school.
Right.
It's like Gossip Girl all the time out there.
And he's very popular, so a lot of people want to take the piss out of him. You know, it makes him a target.
But no, I'm not saying that's good or bad.
Right.
I'm just recognizing that the influence that we are apportioning to the YouTube views is actually something that can be a motivating factor to do stuff in the real world, right? So like this transition from I'm just a developer advocate or I work in DevRel to actual code activism is something that influencers can ultimately do. I mean, the name makes sense then. You know, they're influencing their audience, right?
Mm-hmm.
But if the influencers are being paid by corporate interests, where do the open source projects end up in that, you know, feedback loop? Who's going to be paying? I'm not saying that Theo's someone you can buy out. Love him, but who's?
I mean, if you could, he would lose all of his credibility and be out of that
right.
that racket immediately. I think as far as like, you know, there's a lot of, it's not the first time I've heard this, and like I've seen a lot of folks get kind of like very, very hand-wringing and concerned about like influencers like not disclosing their influences or their biases, and it's like I don't know that you could really find like a more sophisticated audience than software developers with respect to software. I mean, we're the ones who know about software, presumably. If my favorite YouTuber said to do something, I'm still gonna like look into it myself. I don't know, it's not like they're forcing me to like buy a certain brand of shoes and not disclosing that they're made with slave labor or something. Like, it's software, it's fine. I can look at the code.
I mean, I agree with you from the perspective of like veterans who are sitting on the stage here, but young people who maybe just discovered, oh, I got my first laptop, what's GitHub about? And they're coming in totally blank and fresh. And I get this takes me back again to that question earlier about where are the youth of today going to be in 5-10 years if what they're getting is influencer information that from an educated perspective is something that you can filter, but are we teaching children today?
Yes, because here's the point. The point I'm trying to make is that because their primary audience are people who are sophisticated, and because they will lose 100% of their credibility overnight if they are, show themselves to be a nincompoop, like, actually, you could do a lot worse as far as like who should be guiding the new generation of potential software developers. It should be the person whose feet are constantly being held to their fire and forced to disclose their biases, to be extremely like well researched and held to a very high standard.
I'm not sure though it will always look that way. Like right now, influencers tend to influence with mid to senior engineers. You catch up on what's new by watching Fireship, and it is a very sophisticated, qualified audience. But I also think, one, humans are fallible, and we fall into this idea that, well, that wouldn't trick me. And number two, there are plenty of influencers today who are specifically catering to people who are just starting their careers. I can't tell you how many get started in your product marketing career, watch this da-da-da-da today, I see stream past. And for people who are brand new to the industry, it could be very easy for a big player to just come in, buy up all those top of funnel influencers and ensure that other players just never got heard from. That is a model that could happen one day. It's got a very small cap on it, industry for influencership to take off on. There's kind of a question is, I think what you're getting at is this like politics? Should we be worried that perhaps the top of funnel will just get bought out and there'll be no room for people to learn how to think for themselves and become that sophisticated audience?
I feel like predatory boot camps are a much more sort of pressing threat as far as that angle goes.
Ooh, predatory
just
boot
because
camps. So you're saying there's a precedent.
I am saying that they have been the educational industrial complex in our industry has been quite bad for a very long time.
I'm not disagreeing with you on that one.
All right, so we're about at the end of the panel. Let's have some hopeful thoughts. Last 5 minutes, like, what's the best thing that can happen to your community in the next 5 years?
The best thing that can happen to my community, I guess that is JavaScript developers. I hope it keeps growing. I do think that your point about browser stagnation is rings true to me, and I think there is a worry that there's just too big browsers and that they're not very incentivized to keep improving things. Maybe that leaves the room open for something else entirely to come along. But I mean, at least in the dev tool space of JavaScript, which is much smaller than all of this, I hope we can share code better. That's what I would say.
All right, Isaac, what about you?
Yeah, I guess we kind of have the same community. and I mostly agree with everything Ryan just said. I guess just to kind of like double click on the like browser stagnation issue, we have like 3 runtimes now that are quite popular, getting a lot of attention. There's like Node, the old one, Dino, the less old one, that's kind of the weird one, and then Bun, which is like trying to split the difference, and it's like the fast version of the old one, but doesn't actually work yet. I'm really hopeful for, and then also there's web browsers. So I'm really hopeful for the work being done in the Winter CG group, which is trying to kind of like come up with web standard-based ways to solve common server-side JS problems. In a lot of ways, it reminds me of kind of the original motivation behind server JS, which became common JS. And yeah, and so like they're, you know, like building sort of a standard for doing a lot of these things, which I mean, Dino is usually kind of at the forefront of trying to be a browser like JavaScript language platform. Node kind of is dragging along this massive legacy behind it. But right now it's still very, very difficult to build things in a truly like runtime agnostic way, even though we're all using the same language.
Okay, Rachel, last word for you.
All right, and in my world, my community is well, people learning to code and people trying to teach people more about code and programming, not just for the web, but for all platforms out there. What I want to see is, I want to see all kinds of different thought leaders coming from different backgrounds, building their audiences and becoming those influencers, because there's no better way to teach women to code than for them to see themselves in a teacher who is sharing with them, you know, how to become a senior, what the newest property is. People trust people like them. When I worked on the React projects, one of our biggest challenges was like, how do we get React Native's documentation translated into Mongolian? And there'd be a community member who would go out there, fork it, and pay a translator to do that. And I want to see more people in more places, not looking to other people in far off lands or different groups to show them the way, but to look to each other. I want to see communities sprouting for all these changes. That is my hope. That we will not just be looking to big companies to tell us what program to use and how we should code, but to look to each other more. We've always been building this place forward, and I want us to continue doing that. More hands on deck.
All right, well, I guess that means your hands are on deck. When we started this conversation, it was the past. Now we're in the past's future, and I think it's going to be a wonderful ride, and get involved in standards. That's a nice takeaway, and get involved. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.